Civilizing the other through sport, Canada. In the late 19th century, there was not much leisure time for sports. However, it was a majority of upper-class white settlers who participated in sports. Local activities would be enjoyed only in segregated social clubs. Examples could be tennis, skating, and ice boating. Sport at this time in Canada greatly reflected things like social hierarchy, class behaviors, and popular patterns of existence. In the 1920s, the norm was for each Canadian city to have 3 professional sports teams: ice hockey, field lacrosse, and baseball. At this point, major sports teams would compete for local fans, allegiance, and attention, taking place in local regional settings. Nationally competitive leagues for city-based teams were growing rapidly following World War II, such as the Canadian Football League. From an early point, it was believed that Canadians were the top-ranking hockey players in the world. In 1960, the NHL began the idea of globalization. This began with the 1972 Summit Series, or Super Series, which was an 8-game series between the Soviet Union's and the Canadians' best hockey players at the time. With the Canadians winning this game, hockey became a strong force of nationalism within Canada.
All right, early integration and exclusion of Black Canadians. So,
The early integration and exclusion of Black Canadians. The Colored Hockey League. It was started in 1895 in Nova Scotia by a group of local black leaders who wanted to encourage black men to come to church by offering them something fun to do as well. They were influenced by the African-American Booker T. Washington, who believed education and self-help would lift black people up in society. The league was formed when organized hockey was still a new sport, and the first organized team was formed at McGill in 1879. The Colored Hockey League faced challenges from the beginning, because it only had access to rinks after the white leagues were finished their seasons, which meant playing in February and March, and it meant playing on worse ice. Still, it expanded quickly from its original 3 teams. From 1900s to 1905, there were more than 12 teams and hundreds of players. Games were actually very popular and sometimes got bigger crowds than games featuring white players. The influence of the Colored Hockey League. When the CHL started, they played with no official rules except the Bible. I mean, obviously, because they started from a church. But this meant that the style of play was very physical and also entertaining and fast. Some key elements of today's hockey game, as you know it, actually came from the CHL. So the slap shot is actually credited to a player named Eddie Martin, and a goalie named Henry Braces Franklin was the first goalie to drop on his knees. It's a pretty cool nickname. So, decline of the CHL. The league quickly declined from its peak years because white owners stopped giving them as much good ice time. So even before they didn't have good ice time, they got even worse ice time. So a dispute had developed over the future of the land that Africville was located on, which led white rink owners to refuse the CHL ice time. Newspapers and media also stopped covering the games, and the league fell apart. The league was brought back again in the 1920s, but by then the NHL had formed, and the CHL was never as popular as it had been. So, black athletes in track and boxing. Sports like track and boxing were a lot more welcoming than hockey for black athletes. It makes sense because it fits more with the stereotypes of black people who are thought to be best at sport involving raw speed, strength, and aggression, but not at sports which needed intellect, such as team sports. So black athletes could be successful at sports and track, but for team sports they had to start their own leagues. So the picture in the bottom right is George Godfrey, and he was a boxer from PEI. He earned the title of World Colored Heavyweight Champion, but could never achieve his goal of being the world champion because the world champion refused to box a black man. In his later years, the press called him Old Chocolate, which I think is kind of racist, and was also saying he wasn't very good because supposedly he got worse when he got older. So black athletes were also more successful in track and field. So in 1912, John Army Howard was the first black Olympic athlete for Canada in the 100-meter dash. Even though he was accepted on the team, he still faced racism and wasn't even allowed in the same hotel as his white teammates. He became the Canadian champion in the 100-meter dash. I believe his grandson also became his grandson also became a world champion in track as well, which is pretty interesting. So Barbara Howard was the first female black athlete to compete internationally for Canada at the British Games in 1938.
Canada.
Early integration, exclusion of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples in Canada had their own lands, had their own sports, prior to contact that were used to learn skills of survival and also for recreation. For example, what is now lacrosse had earlier roots in a game with religious significance called the Creator's Game. After contact, mainstream sports were used at residential schools as part of the mandate to civilize or assimilate Indigenous children who were denied access to their traditional sports. Some residential school survivors stated that the sports helped them survive their experiences, but its intent was to assimilate or to kill the Indian in the child. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report included 5 recommendations on increasing recognition of the contribution of Indigenous athletes in sport and increasing the access and funding to sports for Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous athletes still do not have access to many sports because of the location of the reserve communities located far outside of urban life, and many cannot afford the equipment either. Indigenous athletes were celebrated in the 1900s, but only in sports considered appropriate, meaning where it met the stereotypes of the day, such as running, canoeing, hockey. For example, Tom Longboat was a famous Onondaga runner from the Six Nations near Brantford, and from 1906 to 1912, he won almost every major race in Canada, the United States, and Europe, and has set a number of world records. But he was described in media reports in racist terms such as redskin and lazy. Other Indigenous athletes in the 1900s include Joseph Benjamin Keeper, Norway House Cree First Nations long distance runner, competed in the 1929 Olympics and won 4th in the 10,000 meter. Kenneth Moore played hockey, won gold in the 1932 Olympics. Fred Saskamoose, Big River First Nation. He was the first First Nation hockey player in the NHL in 1953. Sharon and Shirley Firth, Gwich'in First Nation, they were cross-country skiing, competed in 4 Olympic Games. Reginald Joseph Leach, Barron's River First Nation hockey, top NHL scorer in the 1970s and early 1980s. Lynn Morris, Mohawk canoe kayak, won gold in the 1984 Olympics. And Wanique Corn Miller, also Mohawk of Kawana. Water polo, gold medal at the 1999 Pan American Games.
Racism and integration and exclusion of other immigrants. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, gold and bronze medal winners in the 200-meter race in the 1968 Olympics, were the first to do the clenched fist Black Power salute and were expelled from the games for doing so. Jackie Robinson became the first African American who played in the major leagues in 1947. In the 1940s, African American players slowly started playing professional sports, but in the 1950s, professional sports became desegregated. Muslim women have been excluded from sporting competitions because of their hijab. They were not allowed to compete because the hijab was claimed to be a safety hazard. In 2012, FIFA finally allowed women to wear head covers and hijabs. Many Sikh boys are still discouraged from wearing their turban in sport because, but it is becoming more accepted. John Taylor is the first Black Olympic gold medalist in 1908.
Racial diversity in Canadian sports since 2000. In the year 2000, all levels of Canadian governments recognized the barriers that First Nations face when playing sport. It is much harder for them to get involved. The Canadian sport policy was developed by the government to improve the sports experience of all Canadians. In 2001, Jordan Tutu became the first Inuit athlete to play in the NHL, which was a very big step for First Nations. And Bridget Laquette became the first woman to play on the women's national hockey team in 2016. Since 1995, the Toronto Raptors have had a great impact on Canadians. They have made basketball a very popular sport in Canada, along with being very inclusive and a very positive message for their fans. The two official sports of Canada, however, ice hockey in the winter and lacrosse in the summer, are almost opposite in terms of diversity and inclusiveness. The NHL is constantly called out by former players for not being inclusive. While on the other hand, World Lacrosse is the only international sports organization that allows Native American tribes to compete as sovereign nations, separate from Canada or the US. This can give them a source of pride. They can compete for something that is actually theirs, not a country they are not part of. North American Indigenous Games and Arctic Winter Games. The NAIG began in 1990 and was a way for young First Nations peoples to come together and compete representing their own nations. 14 sports are featured at this competition: canoe and kayak races, lacrosse, rifle shooting, badminton, baseball, basketball, golf, soccer, softball, swimming, volleyball, wrestling, track and field events, and cross-country races. The Arctic Winter Games are also pretty self-explanatory. They take place every 2 years since 1970. Host cities change between northern Canada, Alaska, and Greenland, rotating every time. The sports in this competition are more towards northern culture. These sports include biathlon ski, biathlon snowshoe, cross-country skiing, curling, dog mushing, figure skating, gymnastics, ice hockey, speed skating, snowboarding, table tennis, volleyball, and wrestling. Northern peoples could compete in their own games on their own territory, and that's why this is important for them.
Question: Why do you think that most Canadians why do you think that most Canadians don't know about the contributions of Indigenous and Black athletes in Canada? What is it about sports that it can be used by one group to dominate another?